In the 13th century, the mendicants, there was an order of monks who took a vow of poverty and eschewed things and wandered from place to place. And their ministry was one of being a witness by going down the road from place to place, preaching the gospel, evangelizing, in via, on the way. And so it reminds us today that the church really is indeed, we are a people of the way. So our next presenter, Keith MacPherson, is a candidate for ordination in the United Church of Canada, and he is going to present on pilgrimage, wandering and wondering, pilgrimage and the experience of Christian discipleship. So let's hear from Keith.
Last summer, I went for a walk. A 225-kilometer walk. An 8-day walk on the south shore of Nova Scotia, from Liverpool to Halifax. This pilgrimage, the very first way of St. Columba, the Camino Nova Scotia, was sponsored by the Atlantic School of Theology and organized by our own Reverend Dr. Rob Fennell, Professor of Systematic Theology. When I heard Dr. Fennell was organizing the Camino Nova Scotia, I immediately wanted to do it. It appealed to me on some level that I couldn't put into words. Now, when you tell your family and friends that you're going on a pilgrimage in Nova Scotia to walk for 5 hours or more every day for 8 days, the reactions vary from outright astonishment, you're going to do what? To restrained bemusement and raised eyebrows. Oh, that's interesting, Keith. A walking pilgrimage in our Canadian context is an unusual activity. For me, it turned out to be a beautiful experience. Dare I say it was transformational. It was richly rewarding. If this was church, it worked for me. It was physical, it was communal, it was painful, it was fun. It was like a retreat, but not like those boring, sitting down, navel-gazing, self-reflective, mantra-chanting, incense-burning, contemplative, lost-in-your-head kind of retreats. Those are fine, but just not my cup of tea. No, it was physical. You had to move, you had to walk. Sometimes you had to talk, sometimes you were silent. You were outside in nature for many hours, day after day. All your senses were engaged. The smells, the sounds, the views that unfolded before you, the coarse gravel pressing through to the balls of your feet. Being in the United Church for some time, why had I never heard of pilgrimage before? I was curious. My interest in the topic grew from my curiosity and the need to understand my own experience on a deeper level. I wanted to determine how others experience pilgrimage. How does the experience contribute to spiritual growth and formation? My primary research question, how does the experience contribute to contemporary Christian discipleship? Since I began my study, it seems everywhere I turn, in print, films, magazines, social media, the topic of pilgrimage is hot. Perhaps one of the best known pilgrimage routes in the world right now is the Camino de Santiago de Compostela, the Way of St. James. This 800-kilometer walk from southern France through all of northern Spain, across 3 mountain ranges, ending in Santiago, where the relics of St. James are interred, takes most pilgrims walking 25 kilometers a day, about 32 to 33 days to complete. To receive the coveted Compostela, the certificate of completion, pilgrims must walk at least the last 100 kilometers. In 1989, 5,760 pilgrims received their official Compostela certificate. In 2013, 215,880 received their pilgrim certificate. This incredible growth in pilgrimage mirrors a period of declining attendance in our churches. Should all this simply be dismissed as spiritual tourism? Or is there something happening on a deeper level? What can we learn from pilgrimage that informs how we do church? I chose to conduct a phenomenological study. It is a method of research that is termed qualitative. Basically, that means it is research derived from conversations. Your data is in the form of words, phrases, and sentences that arise from your interviews. Phenomenology is based on the study of lived experiences. I wanted to hear participants' voices. My goal was to describe what all participants had in common. The objective was to distill from the collected data the essence of the experience. I designed a series of open-ended questions to elicit a rich volume of descriptive data from my interviewees. Through social media, video, and word of mouth, I was able to identify and interview 6 participants. The only criteria required were recent participation in a walking pilgrimage and a willingness to sit down and talk to me. 5 of the interviews were conducted face-to-face and 1 via the internet with video conferencing software. Each interview was digitally recorded and then transcribed. The process of coding, an inductive method of extracting themes and categories from the data that answered my research question, followed. The names of my participants have been protected by pseudonyms. I would like to introduce to you now my 6 participants. Maggie, Lori, Carol, Daryl, Rick, and Herschel. Pilgrimage has a rich history in the tradition. The word pilgrim is derived from the Latin word peregrine, meaning having a tendency to wander. A peregrinatus is one who traveled abroad, literally across fields. Pilgrimage is a practice common to many of the world's religions. In the Christian tradition, a pilgrim has come to mean a person whose journey is made for God, or at least for some deep purpose to do with identity and life story. Thus, the journey is referred to as the pilgrimage. Traditionally, we associate pilgrimage with a journey to a shrine or a sacred place. However, in the Celtic tradition, pilgrimage is not about the destination or relics of the saints or a particular holy place. It is about the ongoing life journey and the people you meet along the way. The outward physical journey is principally an opportunity to to explore the inner geography of our spiritual lives. Pilgrimage is also one of the seven ancient practices of Christianity that involved from roots in Judaism. In the book of Genesis, God commands the patriarch Abraham, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you." Abraham is part of a nomadic and wandering culture. He leaves Haran at the age of 75 for the land of Canaan because God told him to pack up and move on. So along with Sarah and his nephew Lot, he goes to wander after God, to see the place God will show him. The main things that descendants of Abraham and Sarah, the main thing that the descendants of Abraham and Sarah were to remember, as the writer of Deuteronomy notes, was the fact that a wandering Aramaean was my ancestor. 3 times during the year, at Passover, Shavuot, and Sukkot, Judaism required all your males shall appear before the Lord, the God of Israel. This journey to the temple could be complex, often dangerous, lasted over many days, and in difficult terrain and inhospitable climate. Biblical scholars have noted in the foundational narratives of the First Testament what seems to be a preference by God for the wanderer over the settler, citing the Cain and Abel story as a primary example. The nomadic shepherd brother Abel over the settler tiller of the land brother Cain. In many of the theophanies of the First Testament, God appears as the traveler. Jacob, camped out in the wilderness at the Jabbok River, wrestles with a man who shows up during the night and turns out to be God. The slave girl Hagar, and mistress of Abraham, encounters God in the form of an angel while lost in the desert. The angel asks the typical question of pilgrims who meet on the road: "Where have you come from, and where are you going?" Hospitality to the wanderer and protection of the stranger is one of the primary lessons of the Sodom and Gomorrah story. When God became human, he was a homeless vagrant walking around Palestine, continually preaching about the kingdom of God and performing miraculous cures of the sick and injured. God, as Jesus, came to earth in a vessel of flesh and blood, a body subject to the aches and pains and blisters of walking. Of course, Jesus walked everywhere. He was in a boat a few times. He walked on water on one occasion and rode on a donkey once, but mostly he walked. He just walked. His was a body that experienced the entire climate of heat, cold, rain, wind of the Mediterranean as he walked around Galilee and Judea. Jesus was a person who feasted at weddings and sat down to eat with tax collectors, similar to some of the pleasures experienced by pilgrims, the pleasures of relationships, of conversation, of exhaustion, of silence. In early Christian tradition, followers of Jesus were spoken of as the way. The birth of Jesus inaugurated the first pilgrimage motif of the Gospels, with the journey of the wise men to the side of the infant Jesus. John the Baptist announces the ministry of Jesus with metaphorical language of the road. "Prepare the way of the Lord, make his paths straight." Jesus generated pilgrimage during his ministry, recruiting the fisherman and the tax collector Matthew, to whom he says, "Follow me." The physical act of walking is by its nature a form of repentance, a turning away as demonstrated by these gospel stories. These stories where people leave their old lives behind to follow the one who offers a new way of living. The gospel narratives end with the pilgrimage of Jesus to his own death on the hill at Calvary. Reflecting our understanding of pilgrimage in the Celtic tradition as an interior journey, the Apostle Paul, writing to the Ephesians, prays that according to the riches of his glory, he may grant that you may be strengthened in your inner being with power through his Spirit, and that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith as you are being rooted and grounded in love. Two overall themes emerged from interviews with participants. The first was walking. Walking does things for the individual walker. Beyond fostering health, walking allows the feet to lead the mind and heart. With a fixed rhythm and established breathing, walking releases us from our normally fragmented and conflict-filled consciousness, and provides an altered state of mind for prayer, reflection, and conversation. Danish philosopher and theologian Søren Kierkegaard was familiar with the virtues of walking when he wrote, "I have walked myself into my best thoughts, and I know of no thoughts so burdensome that one cannot walk away from it. If one just keeps on walking, everything will be all right." A 2014 study by Oprezzo and Schwartz from Stanford University would seem to confirm Kierkegaard's observation. Their study found that creative output following a walk compared to sitting increased by 60% when measured by novelty and number of ideas generated. Walking may be dull, repetitive, and monotonous sometimes, but nevertheless rich in cognitive benefits. Participants spoke of the contemplative space that walking long distances was able to engender. They described walking at times as almost an embodied form of meditation. Indeed, Darrell spoke of it in that exact language. I thought of it as sort of a walking meditation. Reflecting on the rhythmic nature of placing one foot in front of another, Darrell remarked, "Walking is almost like a chant that focuses you." Rick noted a similar feeling, stating, "You were sort of in your head, not really paying attention to where you were going." Herschel found the time he spent walking enabled him to engage in some long-term evaluation about my life going forward, which I hadn't seriously done up to that walk. Participants spoke about the simplicity of walking. And to days reduced to the basic level of need. Lori said, "You just wake up and walk. You just walk. It's just you walking, and that's all you have to worry about," said Rick. Carrying a backpack with all one needs for a pilgrimage was an epiphany for Maggie on what living simply and minimally with less stuff in her life might look like. She remarked on how life can be so rich when it is so simple. I learned about simplicity. The physical act of walking long distance places stress on the body, and this emerged as a key element Blisters, sprains, shin splints, aches, skin irritations, strains, exhaustion, and biting insects were common. Herschel remarked on the self-emptying effect of prolonged walking when he said, "The idea of walking all day and being exhausted was good." Rick observed that the shared experience of pain was a conversation opener that made meeting people easier. The first thing you start talking about is what's hurting today. You can compare ailments and how to fix it. When the journey was physically demanding for Maggie, she spoke about accessing an unknown and previously untapped source of resilience and strength. She observed that in her non-pilgrimage life, we live in a pretty coddled environment. Enduring the physical challenges and working through the pain and discomfort created a sense of achievement for Carol, who said, "I've always felt in my life if I can manage the physical challenges, then I can manage the other challenges too." Maggie added this sense, but added, "The physical endurance that you demand of yourself also puts you in a more open place." The intimate contact and exposure to the natural landscape that walking generates emerged as an important component. Participants reported heightened sensory experiences. Maggie explained, "You really felt held in God's hands when you were totally immersed in nature. Day after day, immersed in nature." Reflecting on the pace of walking and the opportunity that slowness afforded for seeing in new ways, she said, "What you see and how you feel it and taste it and experience it and witness God's beauty is so different than when you drive by it." Carol, too, expressed a nearness to God. She said, "When I can walk through the woods or through a path and feel deeply that God is close." Seeing nature in a way that one might not notice in the course of an ordinary day, Carol stated, "I also enjoyed when I was doing this. There were flowers or grasses on the side, and there was a little bit of wind, and you could see the shade of these plants moving so delicately in the wind." In talking about the landscapes, participants noted that certain elements stood out for them. Maggie said, "I like the open space where you could see a long ways away, and you could see where you were going." The second overarching theme to emerge from my data was community. Participants experienced authentic community within the shared experience of pilgrimage. Community formation developed from a number of elements. Participants spoke about sharing meals, sleeping in close quarters, taking care of each other, and engaging in conversations. It created a space to connect authentically with oneself and with one another. The interviews revealed that a focus on individualism gave way to fellowship. Carol experienced the community as a place where she said, "Okay, I can say this, nobody laughs or says you are crazy." And she observed, "I think we all really are yearning for intimate relationships." Lori spoke about facing her vulnerability and noticing the vulnerability of other pilgrims when she said, "You have to adjust and accept people's help because you're like, you can't do this alone. You see how vulnerable they are at all points." Lori articulated this leveling effect when she said, "People aren't hiding behind masks." Rick remarked, We were all strangers in the beginning. The most common type of accommodation was a dormitory style with shared bathroom. In Spain, these are called albergues. Communal sleeping arrangements, by reducing individual isolation, contributed to community formation. Rick said, depending on where you were sleeping, some places had a lot of room around the beds, good separation. Other places, you'd have 2 bunk beds, basically side by side. Like you turn over and there's this person right in your face. There. It was a little intimidating, but after 3 or 4 days, you leave your modesty at the door. Lori remembered the snoring and laying in her bunk. Nothing can prepare you for the snoring. Nothing at all. Headphones? No. You can feel the vibrations. Maggie reflected on experiencing grace from the strangers she met. Over the course of walking with them and eating with them, sleeping beside them, you have a whole different conclusion about the nature of that person. One individual stood out in her memory. She said, "We really got to know him. Our first impression was so wrong. He kept bringing us our belongings that we kept leaving along the way." A journal we had left in an albergue a couple of days before. We realized he was taking care of us. We realized he's actually kind of our shepherd. Rick described himself as being very closed off to a certain extent. I tend to keep in my own space and just be me, but there you can't do that. Otherwise, you don't talk to anybody. People on pilgrimage he connected with, but on pilgrimage he connected with himself on a deeper level. To combat loneliness and isolation, Rick was challenged to risk being vulnerable in order to give and receive hospitality. He observed, "I stepped out of my boundaries." You really have to put yourselves out and just trust that this will work out. Like sharing an evening meal with 20 strangers, people you may never see again. You are just open with them. You say prayers together and you sing songs. Participants' responses were more tentative when asked how the lessons of the pilgrimage carried over into daily life. Lori spoke about taking on a new life when you finish the pilgrimage and termed it a new starting point. She remarked, "I now have this standard of how a community should feel and how people should be accepted." Rick admitted that he struggled with sustaining the experience when he returned home. He said, "I try not to be that judgmental, a bit more charitable, more true to yourself." Participants remarked on the space that opened up in pilgrimage to connect with other pilgrims through conversations. The shared experience facilitated intimacy and authenticity in speaking. Lori stated it really awoke an awareness of actually giving people time and attention, because you can be present with someone in a room, but you're not really present with them. You had conversations that you wouldn't have had there been all the distractions that you are used to. Carol remarked that while on pilgrimage she found we could connect with each other without talking about differences. Herschel recalled spending the day walking with another pilgrim. "I heard her whole life story. That was a great experience. So just the fact that you could have a conversation that was more than 5 minutes long, real conversations, slow conversations, because you were walking for hours." Daryl remarked, "You had the luxury of giving the long answer to a question and really exploring something in depth." In summary, for the participants in my study, the two core themes of walking and community identify the essence of their pilgrimage experience. This project set out to determine how the experience of pilgrimage contributes to contemporary Christian discipleship. The findings from my research help us to understand the connections between pilgrimage and spiritual growth and formation. Data from the study suggests that pilgrimage is a multi-layered experience where nature, the physical, the spiritual, and the communal intersect in meaningful and transformative ways. Participants underwent a physical journey that reveals truths about the inner journey of self-discovery. Taken together, these results seem to suggest the need for the communal as the ground for spiritual discernment. Step by step, participants experienced movement through the exertion of their bodies towards those intangible spiritual insights that are so hard to nail down. The heightened awareness of what happens to the body impacts what happens to the mind and spirit. One of the implications of this study would seem to suggest that the best pilgrimages are the ones that allow us to be fully who we are, barriers down, and unguarded. An additional implication of this study is a need for the church to embrace the spiritual seeker by developing a diversity of spiritual practices that are more embodied and physical in nature and which can meet people in their local context, such as the Camino Nova Scotia, the Way of St. Columbo.
Where's Willie Nelson when we need him? On the road again, just can't wait on the road again.
Indeed.
I just led one of those candle-burning, meditative, chanting, navel-gazing retreats that you were talking about.
They're not my cup of tea.
I take your point. Take it right off the mark. Great things to be said about kinesthetic spiritual practices for today. Any questions or comments for Keith?
Keith, I think Dr. Phil should send you on the road to advertise for the community. But more serious question is, have you given any thought to how people pilgrimage who are not physically able to pilgrimage?
Yes, that didn't come out in my data from the participants, but it's a consideration. I noted when I was looking at statistics for the Way of St. James that 66 people actually completed the Camino in wheelchairs. Yeah, and so I just hold that up to you. And I think just speaking personally and from my research, that pilgrimage is an attitude, and when I asked the question about carrying it into the daily life, some participants reported on can a trip to the grocery store be a pilgrimage? So I think it's about attitude, not just, although a lot of what I talked about was physical and embodying that, but there's also a mental state of viewing pilgrimage.
Thank you for your presentation. I wonder, just as you sound less than enthusiastic that a contemplative retreat is your style.
I'm going to take a lot of flack over that, eh?
But I wondered about the participants in this, if anyone was talking about how they found a pilgrimage was really not enhancing of their spirituality.
I didn't encounter that from my interviews, from my data. And just to pick up on what you said at the beginning, I mean, in the pilgrimage, there are lots of opportunities for the contemplative, you know, if you want to sit in prayer, and of course, there's opportunities for that. That's what I think makes it so unique. There's different layers. And I think when you put all these things together, that's what makes it such a unique experience.
That was great, Keith. I want to go.
Oh, great.
Did you get the impression from your participants that it was the physical challenge that was what did it for them? Or the fact that they were essentially like wasting time, like they had nothing to do, they're just walking, and it's kind of boring sometimes maybe, or maybe not, but that it was just the being in the moment and not having anything else that you had to do that did it for them, or neither, something else.
Participants spoke about the physical challenge. Definitely, yes. And I lost the second part of your question.
Just the sort of not having anything to do.
Yes, yeah, that came out very much in the meditative, as I mentioned in my presentation, just just putting one foot in front of the other. I said it kind of induces this meditative state that we experience in other spiritual practices and retreats. So well, you have to think about this as, you know, it's not just a 40-minute walk. You know, it's 5 or 6 hours or more, and it takes a while to get into that place, but it's a transcendent. It can be a transcendent space.
So go.
Yes.
Maybe I missed it, or if you could just talk about pilgrimages in terms of what's the terrain like? Is it a rough terrain? Are you going over rocks most of the time, or sometimes the path smooth, or is it by road or on a trail, or just in general from pilgrimages that you know of?
All of the above.
Okay.
Well, the pilgrimage I experienced was mostly flat. You know, it was on the rail bed, the rail trail from Liverpool. So it's a former railway bed, so it's very well groomed. But one thing you encounter on pilgrimages, you know, is different terrain, and you discover some unique things, such as walking on pavement is not all that great, you know. But if you have blisters, like walking on pavement or walking period is is very painful. As I think I had a slide up there.
Hi, Pete. I was wondering about suffering and pain.
Yes.
Just the endurance of enduring pain and suffering communally with a group of people on the same goal. How that bonded and became a unique, kind of cohesive kind of texture in that experience. But that came out in your interviews.
Yeah, there's. I think Maggie kind of explained it best. She said, you know, we live in such a coddled environment. Lots of times we don't all get to to overcome some pain or to experience. I mean, we have to go out into the world and live with our pain, but some people don't get to experience that, and they experience it on a Camino with just because your body is not used to these long walks. And So pain is definitely, as Rick said, you know, it was a conversation starter. It's something to talk about. It's something you have in common that everyone shares at some point. And right.
What are we hearing now from that direction?
Thanks, Keith. I learned some stuff today. Appreciate that. I was going in to renew my library books this morning, which a lot of them I don't have to renew now, thank God. But I did notice the notice about the next one in June of next year. And I looked at that and I thought, and I've, you know, been talking with you about this outside of this, I thought, well, you know, that'd be kind of interesting. And I looked and it was 10 days in June and I'm hoping to be at a new ministry site on July 1st. Do you think I should do it? Or what?
Absolutely, yes.
Really?
Do it, yeah.
You really do?
Yeah.
Think I'd be too worn out? As long as you don't snore.
Go. Yeah, as long as you're not sore. It's not a race.
I think I saw somebody, yeah.
You talked about your subjects relying on each other for strength. Did any of your subjects discuss that they drew a closeness to God and a stronger reliance on Him in order to complete the journey?
So, in my interviews, and as I think Lori and Maggie both spoke about God and feeling closer to God in the experience of pilgrimage, especially in relationship to being outside in nature. So I would infer from what they said in their interviews that yes, they drew strength from that feeling. Yeah.
Next, wonderful presentation. I agree with what I think you should give this at various churches around the area. I think it's people learn a lot from it and would encourage participation in the next one. You probably have this already. It's just a brief comment, but it was important in your final written project to footnote some peer-reviewed scholarship in terms of the distinction you're drawing between Celtic pilgrimage practices and non-Celtic pilgrimage practices. I think I'm sure it's doable. I'm sure you've done this work, but it can be a difficult argument to make due to the lack of very clear sources we have, and of course the ubiquity of relics in every monastery.
Yes, yeah.
That makes it difficult. But wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I was particularly interested, we mentioned vulnerability, and of course within the Catholic tradition, pilgrimage and procession, which take place outside, is something which is still, it's still that even in Halifax now, we still have from time to time, not used to a procession. But I wonder with the pilgrimage, the vulnerability is you've walked outside the walls of the church. You've exposed yourself, are exposing yourself to, as it were, a public display of faith out in the world. So anyone who sees you, you know, that's a pilgrimage group on a faith journey. Have you addressed it in your response? Talk about this, exposing your faith, both in public display to others, which we normally don't do. We meet in enclosed spaces, enclosed churches. Did any of that come up in your research?
It didn't come up from my participant interviews. No one spoke of that. But from my own personal experience of the Camino Nova Scotia, I can speak to it because it's unusual for a group of 15 people to be walking together, intermittently, sometimes together or not together. Because people stop and ask you what's going on, and well, this is a pilgrimage. We're walking to Halifax, and it's kind of like the reaction I got when I told my family I was going on a pilgrimage, you know. They just don't, people outside of our community don't really know what really pilgrimage is, what it's about. Hi, Sally.
You talked earlier about the experience being transformative for you, and I've kind of been thinking about those categories that we had earlier, and I think the question that's left for me is, your participants in your study, did they speak at all about a sense of personal or spiritual transformation?
You know, my questions, I tried to nail that down. But I think with a lot of things spiritual, it's hard to nail down. And we talked about how it was transformative. So in my analysis of the data, I tried to pull that out of the data, how I perceived people were transformed. And transformation as overcoming familiar ways of being in the world. And those pieces did come out from participants.
Your categories are static. Well, walking's not. But, and so I'm just wondering if there are ways to express those categories in moving language.
I sort of know what you mean.
So in terms of process as opposed to entity, it's just something that I wonder about, and it might be something you think about as you write your paper.
I'd like to talk to you more about that. Yeah.
You talked about people sharing whether sort of, I guess, common conversations about their aches and pains and suffering. So just want to explore that, the suffering as a conversation in a Christian sense. Was there an ongoing theme at all about participating in the suffering of Christ, and through that suffering they were experiencing day to day, that was part of their bringing them closer to God on this community?
Some participants spoke about suffering as sharing in the suffering of Christ. Yes, that came out in a couple of interviews. A couple of participants identified that.
This is the opposite end of suffering. I'm thinking about, sort of fit, able-bodied youth. I just could imagine this as maybe another option for youth interested in becoming disciples, instead of sort of going to a place and having a set of events sort of laid on, and speakers and bands and everything sort of in one place. I think this might sort of provide an opportunity for lengthy conversations that may otherwise not occur.
Yes, pilgrimages in the United Church. Right now, the youth are traveling from the West Coast. They're traveling across Canada to the General Council in Newfoundland. And again, the pilgrimage theme. It's a pilgrimage.
Another thing that we talked about in class, you mentioned the difference between pilgrimage and spiritual tourism. Yes. And the environmental concern about the footprint that pilgrims leave behind as they tromp through various, and that's been a huge problem with the Camino, Santiago Camino. Could you comment on that? I don't know, you might not have gotten there in your data, but how do you feel about that?
Well, I think, it didn't come out in my data, no. But yeah, I mean, anywhere that we go in nature, we have to be careful, I feel, about leaving our footprint. Yeah, that's certainly a consideration. Thinking just recently about the climbers, Mount Everest, it's becoming, there's so many people climbing that it's becoming essentially a garbage heap, it seems like, from what we read, so this is a consideration as Christians to care for nature and to care for the environment, and we need to certainly be aware of that,
Whose foot was that?
That was my foot, Dr. Dean, yes.
And why did you put a pin
Well, you know, it's quite an experience. It's quite an experience when someone offers to drain your blister. You know, I don't know about you, but my feet aren't very pretty. And when someone wants to put a needle through my blister to drain it, leave the thread in because it helps with the healing. I think, you know, I've met Christ in that person.